Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Dear Forest podcast. On today's episode, we will be tackling a very complicated topic, which is international law. Luckily, we have a specialist that will be joining us on the podcast today, and that is Professor Dr. Cliquet, who teaches international environmental and biodiversity law at Ghent University. Personally, I think I learned the most from this episode out of all the other episodes that we've done so far. And so I hope you find it as interesting as I did. All right, hello. Can you tell us your name, where you work, and what you do for work?
Yes, hello. My name is Anne Cliquet. I'm a professor of biodiversity law at Ghent University.
All right, and we have another guest with us today, so I'm going to ask her to introduce herself as well.
Hi, my name is Evie. I'm also a member of the WWF youth team, and I know Professor Cliquet because I followed her course on biodiversity law.
Yeah, okay. Great that both of you could join us today. So there's going to be a bit of a collaboration today and a bigger and better conversation. So yeah, let's get into it.
So on what exactly is international law and how is it different from the national laws in Belgium, for example?
Okay, so international law regulates relationships between countries or states and also other international actors like international organizations, for instance, the United Nations. Now, the biggest difference with national law is that international law is not imposed from above. It's the states, the countries themselves, that decide what rules will be adopted and if or not they will accept them. For example, a state can decide whether or not to join a treaty which is a binding international law.
Okay, yeah, that's a great explanation, super easy to follow. So when you say that it doesn't come from above, can you maybe explain that concept a bit more?
Well, if you compare it to national laws, there we've got a central organization in lawmaking and in law enforcement. It's the government, the parliament who imposes the law on its citizens. Whereas when we're talking about international law, we are talking about legally equal subjects. So they have to cooperate to come to decisions.
Okay, yeah, I think that's pretty clear. So thank you for that explanation. So what kinds of laws and mechanisms exist on an international level to protect nature and more specifically forests?
Well, on nature, there are several international conventions, but when we specifically look at forests, there is no global treaty on the protection of forests. There are, however, several other treaties that can help to protect forests. For example, the World Heritage Convention can do this. But also, more recent times, we see that international climate law and policy are also important to protect forests, because, of course, forests are recognized as carbon sinks, meaning they have the capacity to store greenhouse gases. Aside from the binding laws, we also have voluntary commitments from states and world leaders. For instance, in 2021, the leaders at the Glasgow climate top made a declaration that they committed themselves to protect and restore the forests.
Okay, that's a lot of different conventions and treaties that you've just mentioned. Can you maybe go over what the different organizations are? So I think you started with the World Heritage one.
Yeah. So World Heritage Convention is a convention under the framework of UNESCO, and the main task of that convention is to designate World Heritage sites. And this is, of course, only for those, so forests could also be designated as a World Heritage site. However, this is only for those areas which have what they call outstanding universal values. So it is limited in the sense that it will not be applicable on smaller, tiny forests, for instance. There is, however, another convention that is very important and that could also be applicable to all kinds of forests, and that's the Biodiversity Convention that was concluded in 1992. It's not limited to forests, it's also applied to other ecosystems. But one of the important steps that was taken by this convention or under this convention is a recent global biodiversity framework that was adopted in 2022. And this global biodiversity framework includes concrete targets to protect and restore biodiversity. And to give you one example, one of the targets is that by 2030, they want to have 30% of land and sea protected. And another one is that they want to have also by 2030, 30% of degraded land and sea under restoration measures.
Since you've just mentioned the 30% rule of the Convention on Biological Diversity, how much of the world's forest cover is currently legally protected?
Okay, well, maybe just mention first that forest cover themselves is about 1/3 of the total land area. And it's also important to know that more than half of that is only in 5 countries, Russia, Brazil, the US, Canada, and China. And if we look then at the share of forests in protected areas, it's over 17%. So there's still lots more to be protected. And even in those areas that are protected, we still see that there is tree cover loss. Many hectares are still disappearing, either through forest fires, for instance, or it could also be through logging and sometimes also illegal logging, even in protected areas.
Okay, so I hear that it's difficult to enforce the rule. Are there any mechanism to monitor and enforce this rule?
Well, when we're specifically talking about the 30% targets, then it's important to mention that the Global Biodiversity Framework is legally non-binding. And it's making the obligations under the convention more concrete. And states have the duty to monitor and also to report the commitments. And also under this framework, indicators have been developed. And for instance, for forests, that means that they will look at forest cover, but also at the loss of forests.
Can you maybe explain what legally binding means or looks like in terms of like states in international law? And then, maybe a bit of the difference between, what it would look like on a national level.
Yes. So treaties, for instance, are legally binding. The problem is that there are not really very strong enforcement mechanisms at the international level. At the national level, it's easier when somebody is not complying with laws that you can bring them in front of a court. At the international level, that's more difficult. Also, many of these commitments, like the Global Biodiversity Framework, is not binding. So it depends a lot on how states are willing to do something or not. And still, states have a lot of power themselves, especially when it comes to forests and the protection. For instance, if we look at what Brazil did during Bolsonaro, then they really reduced the protection of the forests. Also, another thing is, of course, it's one thing to have a commitment to protect 30% of land as protected area. Another thing is also about the quality. It's not just the numbers that's important, but also the way that this is managed. And that's even harder to monitor or to control. So that's still an issue with regards to the protection of forests and other ecosystems.
So, if I understood you correctly, there are not a lot of binding rules on protecting forests, but the binding rules that do exist, how are those rules being enforced? Are there some kind of international sanctions?
Well, that's the general problem, although we have binding rules as well, and we have voluntary commitments, but even for the binding rules, there are not so much hard enforcement mechanisms. It's very difficult to bring a state in front of an international court. We have these mechanisms that, for instance, a World Heritage Site, if a state is not fulfilling its obligations, it can be removed from the list of protected areas. And there's also the possibility, if states have conflict with one another, that they can take this conflict to the International Court of Justice. Now, also here we see that, for instance, on deforestation, there's rarely been a case. I just know of one case between the Congo and Uganda, in which Uganda had to pay compensation But this was much broader than just about deforestation. This was because of, amongst others, damage to natural resources, including in the Virunga National Park, which is also a World Heritage Site. But all in all, this is just one example, and there are no other examples that I know of in which a court has been convicted at the international level for not protecting its forests.
And what does the International Court of Justice do if then it looks a little complicated from like in terms of getting somebody into court and getting a conviction, so to speak?
Yeah. So the International Court of Justice is the international court that belongs to the United Nations. So it's one of the organs of the United Nations. And it regulates or deals with conflicts between states. Now, in order to bring a case before the International Court of Justice, a state needs to give its permission. Also, that's a difference with national law. If we do something wrong and we are taken to court, we don't have an option whether or not we want to go to court. At the international level, because you're dealing with equally legal subjects, they have to give their permission. So if a state really doesn't want to do this, well, there is no possibility to bring them for this international court. So that's already one of the rather weaknesses of international law.
That's definitely very interesting. So do you think international laws and regulations on deforestation are currently effective as they are then?
I would say there is still a lot more to do about it, and I would rather have more commitments being made into binding laws that can more strongly be enforced, not only at the international level, but also at the national level, because also there, of course, we have a possibility if a state is a party to a convention and there are concrete obligations. It's not because it's not enforced at the international level that NGOs, for instance, cannot take a state to a national court. So that also creates possibilities. So the more binding and the more concrete obligations we have on forest protection and on restoration, the better it would be.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So can you kind of maybe divide it up into like pros and cons? So things that you think, okay, this is great and we should keep this. And then other things that you think, okay, this is maybe not working as well as it should.
Well, like I said, sometimes the commitments are too voluntary and not enough enforcement mechanisms. On the other hand, of course, we need to keep on having these international targets so they can be translated at the regional or at the national level and create also possibilities there.
Since individual countries still have a lot of responsibility, are there any countries that can be a good example for how to do things better when it comes to protecting forests?
Yes, well, just to mention one example, for instance, Costa Rica was doing bad when it came to forest protection. However, in the 90s, they changed their forest law and they are really doing a good job now. They are tackling, on the one hand, illegal logging, but on the other hand, they're also taking positive measures for the protection of forests, including to have financial input for those who are living in the forest and so on. So that's really created a lot of difference what a country can do.
And what do you mean by financial input?
So what they are doing is they are working through a system that we call payment for ecosystem services, where those who help in protect the forests and the ecosystems that can get a financial return from it. So instead of logging it and destroying it, they can get money in order to protect or restore the forest.
And is there maybe, is it specific groups of people? Will it just be people that live in the area or indigenous people groups?
This could be, I don't know specifically for Costa Rica, but of course indigenous people have a very important role when it comes to the protection of forests or other ecosystems they are depending on. And we see their role also being recognized. For instance, the Global Biodiversity Framework that I mentioned, in several of the targets, they are explicitly mentioned and their role is increasingly being recognized. So I think that's certainly something which is important. And more and more, we have this international commitment to have what we call free, prior and informed consent. So that means that if you do something on the land of indigenous people, then you also have to get their consent and inform them about what you want to do. Unfortunately, we see also that this is not always respected, and that sometimes decisions are taken about the land of indigenous peoples against their interests. We also see examples where an indigenous community could be divided over what has to happen with their land. Should they allow exploitation to take place or not? And another thing that happens is that we see recently also an increase of violence against what we call in general environmental defenders, those who defend the environment, very often the area that they live in. And unfortunately, that's also very often indigenous communities.
And is there any way that, you know, they're being protected? I think that's a very worrying thing that I also didn't really know about. Or I think in general we know that they will disagree maybe with their governments, but I didn't know that there was such a big risk to them for doing really important work, actually protecting their home as well. So
well, you have a couple of documents that try to protect from the United Nations, for instance, that protect the rights of indigenous peoples. Also, we see more and more cases where they go to court in their own country and try also to get this protection. We see international instruments that try to protect the environmental defenders, so there's been lots of attention for that. There is, unfortunately, we still see a rise of violence against them. There is an organization which is called Global Witness, and every year they come up with a report in which they count how many people have been murdered because they were trying to defend the environment. And unfortunately, we see the numbers rise every year.
And do you think there's a reason why that it seems to be increasing, or is it just, I don't know, an inevitability or something that as people become more vocal and maybe more connected via social media, that, you know, then there's more visibility, so it's easier to find a person, say for instance? Or do you think there's something more in the background?
I think there will be a combination of reasons, but I think the more scarce land is becoming, or the more urgent the fight, for instance, for resources is becoming, of course, the more fierce the reaction is if people try to defend, to protect their lands and their territories. And you see that the violence is coming from sometimes the state itself, the country itself, but sometimes also done by mining companies or logging companies and so on. And so the more they feel they are restricted, the more they will react in order to continue their unsustainable activities.
Okay, so you just told us that private companies are also threatening indigenous people. What's the impact of private companies on international law and enforcement?
Well, of course, there is also there a double angle. Companies, on the one hand, can have a very negative impact because they will be the driving force behind deforestation. Sometimes they are doing illegal logging activities or logging for the agro industry. So that's more the negative aspect. They can indeed also have violence against indigenous communities or local communities, or could also do a lot of lobby work trying to stop new regulations being adopted or being implemented or enforced. So that's the more negative side. On the other hand, of course, we also see that they can be a driving force for sustainable activities, and many companies are also at least trying to become more sustainable and are also respecting international rules and sometimes also demand for international rules and to have also a level playing field so that all of the companies have to have certain sustainability activities. And sometimes also they can change their way of handling or the way that they're conducting their activities because of pressure by consumers or pressure by NGOs. Just to give you one example from a couple of years ago, there was a campaign done by Greenpeace against Mattel, the big toy company, that was using package material for instance, for their Barbie dolls, but that was coming from unsustainable and illegally logged forests in Asia. And because of the campaign they did, they actually changed the producer they were working with. So it can really have an impact as well.
So I hear that NGOs can have a huge impact apparently by pointing out the obligations of companies to also protect nature. What other things do NGOs do on an international level to protect forests?
Well, I think the role of NGOs is crucial. They really have lots of things that they can do, and their role is, of course, informal. They can't make laws, but they can, of course, try to push forward states to adopt and implement laws. They can also, of course, do awareness raising amongst the public, and in that sense also create consumer power. They, of course, can also take actions really on the ground through conservation and restoration projects. We have several examples of that, which is really well going. And of course, then a last thing that they can do is also, of course, litigation, meaning they can take states or companies to court if they're not respecting international or national laws.
So, what changes do you think should be made broadly to international law for it to become more effective to protect forests?
Okay, so like I mentioned before, I think having more binding targets on conservation and restoration would really be necessary. And I think the EU, the European Union, can really serve as an example of how you can strengthen cooperation and also have binding laws on conservation and restoration. And I can just mention two examples of recent laws. The first one is recently adopted Nature Restoration Regulation, and which is really about setting binding targets to restore nature within the EU. And another example is the Deforestation Regulation, which is really about making sure that when we import products from forests from outside of the EU, that at least we know that they're coming from sustainably managed forests.
So would you say that EU law is already influencing international law in a positive way?
I would definitely say that this has been the case already for many years. And the EU has been known as what we call a front runner when it comes to environmental laws and policies. And we see that they are very often also trying to influence policies and laws at the international level by trying to introduce the standards that we have in the EU to have this also at the international level. For instance, the Global Biodiversity Framework that I mentioned, there the EU really advocated very strongly to have this framework and, for instance, to have these targets on restoration, to have these targets on protected areas.
Okay, and the other way around, does international law has a big influence on EU law?
Obviously, the EU is also a party to different international conventions. So when these commitments have been made at the international level, the EU as a party to it should also respect those international commitments and obligations. So also in this sense, EU law is very often also influenced by international law.
If there is one thing that you hope someone takes away from everything that you've said today, if nothing else, what would it be?
Well, I think it's clear that international law is not perfect. It's often weak, it's often a compromise, and the problem very often is that it's not sufficiently implemented and not sufficiently enforced. But we don't have an alternative. It's the only way forward, and we only have one planet that we should protect and restore, and international law and international cooperation is the only way to do it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that we should all keep in mind. So yeah, thank you both for being on this episode of the Dear Forest podcast.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
For me as well.